They thought he was dead. The enemy searched every corner of the island, but they never found him. For 70 days, he vanished into the jungle like a ghost, starving, hunted, wounded. And yet, he survived. This isn't a story of war, it's a story of a man who refused to give up. Even when the world gave up on him, forbidden to surrender, trained to outsmart death, this soldier clung to one mission, one order, and one promise. Alone, forgotten, betrayed by time, but never broken. If you've ever felt invisible, abandoned, or pushed beyond your limit, this story will speak to you. Because in the heart of silence, in the darkest part of the jungle, a man proved that resilience isn't about strength. It's about purpose. This is the unbelievable true story of Hiroo Onoda, the soldier who disappeared and became a legend. March 1945. The world was in flames, and the Japanese Empire was beginning to crumble. But deep in the jungles of the Philippine island of Lubang, a young Japanese lieutenant named Hiroo Onoda received an order that would forever change the course of his life. Just 23 years old, his uniform still crisp, his eyes sharp with determination, and his mind trained to resist until the bitter end. Upon arrival, he was given a direct command from his superior officer. You must never surrender, under any circumstances. Even if everything seems lost, you are to continue fighting. And you may only leave the jungle when an officer of the Imperial Army comes personally to relieve you. For many, it might have sounded like a routine order, but for Onoda, it was a sacred mission, a vow etched into his soul. What he didn't know then was that he was about to enter a war of his own, one that would last for decades, long after the world believed the fighting had stopped. The dawn was thick with fog, and the distant sound of gunfire blended with the muffled crunch of footsteps on wet jungle ground. Chaos reigned. American forces had landed on Lubang and were advancing fast. The Japanese resistance on the island was collapsing like a house of cards. It was then that Lieutenant Hiroo Onoda, along with 3 fellow soldiers, made a drastic decision: vanish into the jungle. They knew they couldn't win that battle, but surrender was not an option. Their orders were absolute. With rifles in hand, makeshift packs on their backs, and only the essentials, they abandoned the main outpost and slipped into the darkness of the forest. Every step felt like a gamble. Every rustling leaf could mean an ambush. The rain soaked. Their uniforms and sharp branches tore at their skin, but they pushed forward. For Onoda, this wasn't a retreat. It was duty. It was the beginning of his own private war. No radio, no newspapers, no contact with the outside world. Deep in the jungle of Lubang, Onoda and his companions were completely cut off. And in that brutal silence, one of the greatest illusions of World War II was born. The belief that the war had not ended. In August 1945, Japan officially surrendered after the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The world exhaled in relief. But for Onoda, the war still raged on. He found leaflets dropped from planes saying that Japan had surrendered. But to him, it was pure enemy propaganda. "They're trying to trick us," he would say. Letters from family, voices over loudspeakers, even photographs weren't enough to shake his conviction. Onoda believed his superiors were still in danger, that the mission wasn't over, and he had to keep fighting. So while the rest of the world began rebuilding in peace, Onoda sank deeper and deeper into a war that no longer existed. The first days of Hiroo Onoda in the jungle of Lubang were a brutal shock. He and his companions had traded the battlefield for the unknown, and now the fight was against the environment, the weather, and their own bodies. The jungle was dense, wet, alive. Every step sank into the mud. Towering trees blocked out the sun, creating an eerie, dark maze. The daytime heat was suffocating, while at night the cold cut through their bones. There was no shelter. They slept wrapped in leaves under fallen logs, constantly wary of snakes and venomous insects. Water came from muddy puddles and tiny streams. Food was even harder to find. They learned to hunt small animals, sneak into nearby farms to steal bananas and mangoes, and when lucky, they cooked raw rice in rusty cans. The tension was relentless. Every noise, a snapping twig, a whispering breeze, might be an approaching enemy. Filipino soldiers and American patrols still moved across. The island and Onoda was certain another attack could come at any moment. But to him, the jungle had become his trench, and he was prepared to defend it with the same loyalty he would have given to the homeland he left behind. When night fell over Lubang, the jungle sank into a thick, eerie silence, broken only by the chirping of crickets and the rustling of leaves in the dark. It was under this heavy cloak of darkness that Hiroo Onoda became a shadow among the trees. With careful, calculated steps, he and his remaining comrades would leave their hiding place and infiltrate nearby villages. This wasn't a combat mission. It was about survival. They were starving. Supplies had long since run out, and the jungle could no longer provide enough to keep them alive. The local Filipino villages became their only chance at finding food. They moved in complete silence, like ghosts. Watching the villagers from a distance, they waited patiently until the lights went out and everyone was asleep. Then they slipped into the plantations and chicken coops, taking only what they needed: rice, fruits, sometimes a little meat. They never left traces behind. To Onoda, they were behind enemy lines. One mistake could cost them everything. Each night, the danger grew. Rumors of ghost soldiers spread through the villages. Onoda took this as proof. The enemy was watching, but he refused to stop. Every successful raid meant another day alive, and in his mind, the war was far from over. The silence of the jungle was shattered by a sharp crack, a broken branch, maybe a misstep. It was early dawn, and darkness still blanketed everything like a heavy veil. Onoda and his men were returning from a nighttime raid on a plantation when they heard voices, low, speaking Filipino. They were surrounded. For weeks, villagers had reported strange disappearances of food and sightings of mysterious men lurking. At night, now, local armed patrols had been organized to capture what they called the ghost soldiers. That night, what had begun as a simple survival mission turned into a confrontation. Onoda's men hid behind thick trees and waited. When the first shots tore through the air, the entire jungle seemed to wake up. The Japanese response came within seconds. Onoda fired toward the flash of lanterns, whispering orders and moving, with the precision of a trained soldier. But this was no longer war. These were civilians trying to protect their homes. Still, military instinct took over. The firefight lasted only a few minutes, but the consequences lingered. A local farmer was wounded and the patrol retreated. Onoda and his men vanished once again into the jungle as if they had never been there. But something had changed. The enemy was now real and close. For Onoda, this only confirmed his belief. The war was not over, and if the enemy was still out there, then so was he, ready to fight, always, even if the world outside had already chosen peace. There, in the heart of the jungle, the war had just begun again. Time in the jungle wasn't measured in days, but in silences and distant gunshots. Every sunrise was another victory, but also a reminder that everything could end at any moment. And it was on one of those grey, humid days, heavy with jungle air, that Onoda faced a pain no military training could ever prepare him for: the loss of a comrade. Private Yuichi Akatsu was the youngest of the group. He had a calm, almost innocent gaze, but he was quick, agile, and fully committed to the mission. In recent days, though, he had begun to question things. The leaflets they found, the strange silence from command. He wondered if the war had really ended. That morning, he ventured out alone in search of food, a mistake that would cost him his life. As he crossed an open clearing near a plantation, a Filipino patrol spotted him. The gunfire came without warning. Onoda heard the shots echo through the trees and rushed to the scene, but he was too late. He found Akatsu's body lying in the mud, bloodied, his face turned toward the sky. Onoda knelt beside him. For a moment the forest fell eerily silent. He buried his friend with his own hands, far from the trails, under branches and leaves. No military salute, no flag, no anthem. Only the jungle to witness. That night, the rain poured endlessly, and Onoda didn't sleep. Something had shifted. The jungle was no longer just a battlefield. Now it was a graveyard, and he knew more clearly than ever that for him, this war would end only with death or a miracle. Surviving in the jungle for a few days is already a challenge for any human being. Now imagine staying alive there for months, then years, fully believing you're still in the middle of a war, surrounded by enemies who could strike at any moment. That was Hiroo Onoda's reality. And to stay alive, he developed survival tactics that bordered on the unbelievable. This wasn't just about hiding or finding food. It was about becoming one with the jungle. He didn't live in it. He blended into it. Onoda knew that any trace of human activity could give him away, so everything was done with military precision. His torn clothes were stitched together with plant fibers. Footprints were brushed away with leaves. Fire, essential for cooking, was made in holes dug deep into the ground, covered with foliage to hide the smoke. He drank from streams and collected dew from leaves at sunrise. His diet included native fruits, small reptiles, bird eggs, insects, and, when possible, rice stolen during nighttime raids. He learned where to step, what to eat, and how to treat wounds with jungle plants. Over time, he built small underground shelters camouflaged with branches and leaves, storing improvised tools, dry clothes, and food. To shield from the heavy rains, he used banana leaves as roofing. When his boots wore out, he crafted sandals from scraps of rubber found in wartime debris. Onoda also trained daily. He exercised silently, maintained mental discipline, memorized escape routes, and studied the movements of local patrols. To him, letting his guard down was dangerous. In his mind, the enemy could strike at any moment. Survival wasn't just instinct, it was duty, and he was prepared to see it through even if the rest of the world had already moved on from the war. The jungle, once a place of refuge, was now closing in like a trap. The name Hiroo Onoda had moved beyond whispers among the villagers of Lubang. It had become a target. After multiple encounters, nighttime raids, and isolated attacks on small patrols, the ghost soldier was no longer just a myth. He was being officially hunted. Filipino authorities organized armed groups made up of police and civilians, determined to put an end to the mystery haunting the island. The forest was no longer silent. Helicopters flew overhead, dropping leaflets and broadcasting through loudspeakers. "The war is over, come home." But Onoda didn't believe it. Every attempt at contact was seen as a trap, a trick by the enemy. In his mind, the harder they tried to make him surrender, the clearer the truth became. The war was still going on. Patrols increased. Armed men pushed deep into the jungle with tracking dogs, searching for signs, footprints, food scraps, broken branches. Everything was a clue. Onoda responded with more silence, more caution. He moved like a shadow, only returning to his shelters at night, using false trails and erasing every trace of his movements. The island's atmosphere changed. It was no longer just about survival. It had become a manhunt, and Onoda alone, exhausted, starving, was the last soldier fighting in a war no one else believed in. But that didn't make him weaker. In fact, it made him more dangerous, because a man who believes so deeply in his mission is a man who refuses to be stopped. In war, enemies don't always wear uniforms. Sometimes they come disguised as wind, rain, and cold. For Hiroo Onoda, the Philippine jungle wasn't just enemy territory. It was a battlefield where the weather fought against him every single day. And unlike soldiers, this enemy never slept, never retreated, and never showed mercy. The heat was the first assault. Suffocating humidity clung to his skin, making rest nearly impossible. Swarms of relentless mosquitoes buzzed around him, spreading disease with a single bite. Onoda used large leaves to cover himself, smearing his skin with thick mud to repel them. Each hot day drained his strength, making even the smallest movement feel like a battle. But if the heat was cruel, the rain was merciless. When the monsoons hit, it felt like the world was collapsing. The ground turned to mud, trails vanished, and makeshift shelters caved in. Onoda would curl up under rocks or dig holes in the earth to avoid the floods. For days, he couldn't light a fire. His torn clothing stayed soaked. Water ran down his body like it belonged there, bringing chills, fever, and exhaustion. At night, the cold crept in. Damp air and wind pierced through to the bone. With no blanket, no real shelter, he wrapped himself in thick leaves and shivered until daylight. More than once, Onoda believed it wouldn't be bullets that would kill him, but the climate itself, slow, silent, and ruthless. And yet, he endured. Every storm was a test, every sunrise, a victory. Onoda learned to predict the weather by watching birds, to hear incoming rain by listening to the trees, because in the jungle, surviving the elements was just as vital as surviving the enemy, and he refused to be beaten by either one. Hiroo Onoda wasn't just a soldier lost in the jungle, he was the living embodiment of a code of honor the modern world no longer understood. From the very first day he received his mission, a single idea echoed relentlessly in his mind. Never surrender, never dishonor your country. That order wasn't just military, it was spiritual, it was cultural. For Onoda, surrender was unthinkable, a shame his soul could never bear. Even in the face of hunger, isolation, the death of his comrades, and the slow erosion of time, he held his ground with posture, discipline, and purpose. He cleaned his rifle, kept his uniform as presentable as possible, conducted patrols, exercised his body, and strengthened his spirit, as if at any moment the war could officially resume. It was that blind loyalty to his mission that kept him standing. To him, it didn't matter what the leaflets said or what voices shouted through the loudspeakers. Only one voice had the power to release him, that of a Japanese commanding officer. Until that voice came, he would continue to fight, alone, and with honor. In war, silence can be just as deadly as a bullet. And for Hiroo Onoda, that silence became deafening when loneliness finally caught up with him. One by one, his comrades were gone, some killed. In skirmishes, others vanished into the shadows of the jungle, convinced the war was over. Onoda was left alone. No voices to speak with, no eyes to share the fear, no hands to help carry the weight of daily survival. Just him and the forest. The days began to drag, the nights even longer. He spoke to himself to keep from going mad, repeated orders out loud, marched alone, made imaginary supply lists. Every noise, a snapping twig, the flap of a bird's wings, felt like a threat. And yet, it was also a reminder that he still existed, that he was still alive. Food became harder to find, his strength began to fade. But what hurt the most wasn't the hunger or the fatigue, it was the emptiness. The absence of a familiar voice, the lack of anyone to remind him that he was still a soldier, that his mission still had meaning. The jungle, once a living trench, now felt like an open grave. And still Onoda endured, because even crushed by loneliness he had a mission and a promise he refused to break. The last days of those 70 felt like an eternity. Onoda's body no longer responded with the same sharpness. His legs ached, his arms trembled, and his eyes burned from constant vigilance. The jungle, once a place he mastered with military precision, now seemed intent on swallowing him whole. Every step became a battle against exhaustion. The night cold felt sharper, the daytime heat more suffocating. Open wounds no longer healed easily. Fever came in waves. Hunger never left. One day, while trying to gather food near an old hideout, Onoda stepped into a bamboo trap left by local hunters. The injury was bad. Alone and in pain, he had to drag himself through the forest until he found an improvised shelter. He remained hidden there for days, silent, with the wound festering, his body weakening, and his thoughts fading in and out. And still, he did not surrender. In his mind, at any moment the call would come. His commanding officer would appear in the clearing, uniform immaculate, and say the words, "The war is over. You can come home." And until that day arrived, Onoda endured it all with one unshakable belief. He had been trained to resist, and even if the entire world had forgotten him, he would never forget his mission. Never. He survived. Against all odds, against time, against the elements, against hunger, pain, loneliness, and even against being forgotten. Hiroo Onoda was still alive. But there was one detail that changed everything. The war had ended. And it had ended a long time ago. While Onoda watched over invisible trails and fought enemies that no longer existed, the world had moved on. Japan was rebuilding. Families were mourning their losses and learning how to start again. The planet had entered a new era, divided by superpowers, Cold War tensions, and technological advances. But deep in the jungle, Onoda was still a soldier of the Empire, carrying out the last order he had ever received. To him, the silence on the radio wasn't peace. It was sabotage. The leaflets weren't news. They were traps. And every person who tried to convince him the conflict was over could be a spy. He had survived 70 days, and he would survive many more. But this first stage was the ultimate test. Those days proved that Onoda wasn't just an ordinary man. He was a living symbol of a war that didn't know when to end. He endured the impossible for a belief, a mission, and a promise. And even though the world had made peace, the battle inside him raged on, silent, stubborn, and deeply loyal. So now that you've made it this far, tell me, how can someone go through all of that and still keep going? Hiroo Onoda wasn't made of steel, he was made of purpose. While the world forgot, he remembered. While everyone gave up, he held on, and all of it because of one simple promise. But listen closely, because here's the thing, this story isn't over yet. What happens after those 70 days is even more unbelievable. There's a twist, emotion, shock, and an ending most people have never even heard of. But once you do, you'll never forget it. So here's what to do. Subscribe to the channel right now, hit the notification bell, and stay tuned. Because in the next video, I'll reveal what really happened to Onoda after those 70 days. And why he became the most loyal and forgotten soldier in history. Trust me, if this part hooked you, the next one will blow your mind. I'll see you there. Drop a like, leave a comment with what shocked you most, and share this story.